All right, well, thanks for inviting me to be here. I work at the Geology Museum on campus, and if you have any time while you're in town, you should pop on over. We have maybe the only astrobiology exhibit in the country, so you should come check it out. It was part of our Can 4, our original grant, and now we're in Can 6 as well. So if you like Mars, we have a chunk of Mars on display, Earth's oldest rocks and fossils, so you should come explore. But Bree asked me to give you just some thoughts about communicating to the non-specialist. And so when we think about science outreach, often probably what people think of are this guy or this guy. And I'm here to represent the people who don't dress quite as well as those two gentlemen. And while they do fantastic jobs, you know, everybody can communicate your science. You are all scientists, and I want to give you some ideas as to how you can connect with your audience and use your powers for good. And so I'm just kind of curious, as an informal poll, who has done some kind of outreach? You've talked to the public about your work. Okay, excellent. What are examples of what you've done? Who have you talked to? Where have you been? Anyone? Or you can just boom it out. I don't know if that matters for your...
I gave a talk for an astronomical society in Salt Lake.
A talk for an astronomical society in Salt Lake. What else? Public talks at planetariums.
Camps at the local museum on fossils and dinosaurs.
Nice. Museums talking to campers.
Science demos.
Science demos. Elementary school classroom. Any other brave soul? Science fair keynotes. Yeah, science fairs are great.
Talks to high school students.
Talks to high school students. Excellent. So I wanted to show you a few other examples as well. So we've got, these are, is there a laser pointer? This must be a laser. All right. So talking to kids. A lot of people, when they think about talking to the public, they immediately think about talking to kids. Right. So here we talk to kids about geology. We do events at local libraries or after-school science clubs. So this kid built his own Curiosity rover out of candy. This is something that our grad students did. So Bree and the other grad students were helping host AbGradCon. Led an evening event here in this building called DIY Science. So adults pay money to come here on a date or on their own to do science. And so we had an astrobiology one here in January. I brought a puppeteer here last summer to do some shows at local libraries about Ambrosia, a puppet an alien who was crash landed here on Earth. And then there's also, you can do unconventional venues. We did some Star Wars and astrobiology nights at the ballpark. Here we went to local music festivals and talked about astrobiology in your backyard. And then there's kind of the classic booth setup. So if you're doing, a science festival or something like that. So what I really want to get across to you is that communication is connecting with your audience. And this holds true also for your more professional scientific talks, but really in the realm of talking to the public, they're looking at you as some kind of authority, right? You are the scientist. And so already there's kind of this power differential that exists. And so I have 3 main tips to try and balance out that power differential, right? So I don't want you to go in, and be in a situation where people are cowed by you. It's about connecting with your audience. And that way you're establishing a relationship and you'll get more out of them too. So instead of you just telling them information, they're going to ask questions of you and you'll have a longer time with them perhaps. And you might establish a relationship and get to, they might email you afterwards. And so you can continue to have that conversation instead of it being a one-of where you've like brain dumped on them and then they glazed over and said, thank you very much and walked away. So connecting. What are some ways to connect? Don't use lingo. Now, this is MTV puts together a lingo word cloud every few years. So they polled millennials and said, what are the slang words you use? So don't ask me. I'm not a millennial. But this is just here to represent that, you might think lingo, you're like, yeah, don't talk about redox cycling or, microbiology. Like, don't use those words. But I also want you to think about words like, for you biologists out there, cell. So to some people, some communities, cell indicates somebody who's in jail. They're thinking about an environment. And so you might need to think about that depending on the audience you're talking to. For you chemists out there, isotope is a word that you sling around all the time, but I've quizzed people in our museum. When we were putting together our exhibit, I sat out in the gallery and I asked questions of people. I had them read exhibit text and said, what do you think people might get confused about with this? And I would ask, what does the word isotope mean? And the number one answer was, chemistry? Okay. So the general public, when you're thinking about talking with them, you're thinking of somebody who may have taken their last chemistry class in high school, right? If you're talking to an adult, that was a while ago. And really paring it down to like a middle school level, even if you're talking to adults. For geologists, plate. Plate, you eat off of plates, right? We talk about plate tectonics, we sling around that word. It's a normal word that everybody, it's not a complicated word to say, but it has a different meaning to a geologist than it does to a kid. And so when we talk about plate tectonics in our museum, we actually kind of make a joke that we're not talking about, what you eat off of, but we're talking about these big pieces of the Earth's crust. And one other story, I met this woman who was talking about citizen science, where you have citizens going out collecting data for you and inputting it. And she was referencing a program that NOAA does. And so she's talking about how with NOAA you can track the weather and it'll tell you if it's raining. And her audience was thinking about NOAA and the Bible, not the National Oceanographic Atmospheric Association. Like that's, thinking about those words that you're using. Even NSF, they probably know who NASA is. So that's good on you for being an astrobiologist. Okay, so lingo. Be careful about lingo. If you need to step out of it, ask a friend, a roommate, a family member. Family members are great because usually they can be pretty brutally honest with you too. And so you can ask them, what does this mean to you? Or, do you know what this word means? And they'll tell you if they do. Okay, number 2 is that this is not a one-way street. And I kind of alluded to that. You're not there to just brain dump. You aren't just the authority who's conveying information. I want you to think about it as a learning experience for you as well. So every time you do outreach, it's almost as though you're doing an experiment. You are getting information from your audience as much as you're giving information. So you can be asking questions, learning about misconceptions. You hear a lot in the news about, what people understand when it comes to climate change or when it comes to, a lot of different issues that are in the news. And it's through these events that you can start to tease apart where people are getting some misconceptions, where they have it right. And so it's not about, I'm right, you're wrong, but it's about you becoming a better communicator so you can go forth and actually educate people about the things that they're confused about. And this is something that I've definitely experienced too, where I've asked a question and, kids might understand one thing really well, and another thing that I thought they would have a pretty good hold on, they don't. All right, and then finally, this is something that when you are talking to the public, a difference between talking to your peers is that you're also representing science. And so I want you to think about showing your heart and being vulnerable with that audience and showing them who you are. There's a number of different studies that have been done called Draw a Scientist. Maybe some of you have heard of these, where they ask kids to draw a scientist, and then those kids get to have kind of a long-term relationship with a scientist, and then they draw a scientist at the end, and they invariably go from somebody who kind of looks like Einstein to somebody who looks like the person they've been working with. And so it's your opportunity when you're interacting with the public to represent. And so by opening yourself up and talking a little bit about yourself and why you are interested in the things that you're studying, why you're invested in it. That helps people connect to your subject matter instead of just diving right in to what it is that you're working on or whatever you're trying to convey that day. You can connect with them, share a little bit of your own story, and that can be really powerful for them. One great example of this, Alan Alda, do you guys know who that guy is? Right, he was on MASH. When he kind of retired out of acting, he became a real passionate science communicator, which kind of seems crazy, but he's founded this institute at Stony Brook that's all about teaching scientists improvisation. Because his theory is that by giving you some kind of basic acting tools, that you'll be able to communicate better. And so it's very basic things like gesture and using facial, changing your face and telling stories that are personal. And so in one of my favorites that I've seen recently, this woman is talking about BPA, which is the stuff everybody's scared about in plastic. And she says, the first thing she says is, so when you were a baby, probably, your favorite toys were made out of plastic. And he interrupts her and he says, no, make it more personal. And she's like, okay, so if you had kids, your kids probably would have plastic toys. And he's like, no, make it more personal. Make it more personal. And she's like, okay, my son, his toys are all plastic and he puts them in his mouth all the time. And you can just see this shroud fall away from her, and suddenly she is connecting with her audience. She has her own personal investment in why she studies this, and she studies marine environments, and this BPA ends up in the marine environments. And so she has this little introduction for how she ends up studying what she does. And for all of you, you guys have like the cream of the cream of the cream of things that you study. You're looking for life in space. This is like super easy connection. So talk about your own investment and why you do what you do. Okay, so maybe you're thinking, okay, that all sounds good. I'll do some more outreach. What next? I have 3 short tips. One is, and I had to throw this in for my 4-year-old, who looked at my talk notes and he was like, superheroes, what are you doing? Think about your strengths, all right? Who do you like talking to anyways? Do you like talking to kids? Maybe then you should talk to more kids. If kids are kind of not your thing, maybe think about I always like talking to my grandpa at Christmas. Maybe you should go to a retirement home and do a presentation there. So think about what you do already and what your superpower is, and capitalize on that. You don't have to, I know you guys don't have a lot of time. You don't have to be worrying about well, I'm not very good at talking to preschoolers, so I probably should go to a preschool. Don't worry about that. If they freak you out, don't go to a preschool. And then how do you like to engage with people? Do you like giving talks, or do talks make you nervous? Do you like coming up with demos? Do you like to write? Maybe a blog is the right thing for you. And so spend a little time thinking about how you can channel what little amount of time you have into something that will give you great rewards. Think about what your resources are. So maybe you already have a connection with a museum or a library or an elementary school. You could do some mentoring or some tutoring. Doesn't have to be in astrobiology. It could be in math, right? Science fair judges. Every time you talk to your neighbor, or you're standing in the line in the grocery store and you see some article on National Geographic that kind of relates, and you're kind of chit-chatting with the person next to you in line, these are all opportunities. You're at a party drinking beer, you can chat. Somebody, the number one thing people ask you is so what do you do, right? Have an answer for that. And a good example, yesterday I was with my kids and I was chatting with these 2 ladies who are grad students. I said, so what do you do? And one of them said, oh, molecular biology, viruses. And that was it. And I'm like, well, I know what viruses is. So I explained it to my kid. But if she had 3 sentences about what it is that she does, that would have been awesome. And maybe it would have opened up a conversation between the 2 of us. And so have those 3 sentences, the distilled little version. I mean, they've been called elevator speeches, whatever. It's just what you do, right? And you should be able to say it. And that's a point of connection. By the way our conversation went, it kind of like fell flat, and we ended up not talking about what she does. All right, and then finally, my last big tip is, if nothing else, take this away. Take pictures of yourself. I never thought I'd be a proponent of selfies, but think about when you're doing your work, take a picture. Have somebody take a picture of you, whether it's in the lab. Geologists kind of have it easy because they go do awesome things outside, like fly helicopters, dig up dinosaur bones. But take a moment and have somebody take a picture of you doing what you do, no matter what. If you're working on a machine, have them take a picture of you. At the bare minimum, I want you to think about, in your department when there are talks, you get the little abstract hanging up on the bulletin board as you're walking through the building, and it has a little biopic there, and often it's just kind of the classic, like semi-smiling face. But wouldn't it be nice? Don't you feel more engaged when that person took the time to like put one of these photos as part of their abstract when they come to talk? You're more likely to go to that person's talk because you're like, well, that's kind of cool. I see them doing something. And so take a picture of yourself, have that kind of stuff in your back pocket for when you are invited to go give a talk. You can throw in a couple slides of you doing the work instead of just the work. Okay? So that's it. That's what I have for you. Try and connect with your audiences.
Thank you, Brooke.
Yeah.
Are there any questions? All right. Graham, you're closer, so I'll go to you first.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I love science communication, so I always like hearing these kinds of talks. There are a bunch of people in this room I know who love science communication and outreach. Several of us were involved in NASA's FAME Lab in the past year or previous years before that. The host of that, Sean Domingo-Goldman, has this comment he makes every time he MCs this event. And for those of you who don't know, NASA FAME Lab is a science communication competition where you give a 3-minute talk with only maybe one prop in your hand and no slides. And the idea is to convey an idea easily to the public. So Sean, the MC usually for this event, has this idea he likes to share with people that a lot of people in science feel that we need another Carl Sagan. We need someone else to be the champion of science communication, to be that one person that drives it forward. And what Sean points out, and what I love about this idea, and kind of how you started your talk tonight, was this idea that we don't need just one more Carl Sagan. We need thousands of mini Carl Sagans. We need all of us in our own lives expressing ourselves in our own special way to take what we have from our experiences and use that to share our science with others. And so I really enjoyed hearing that as the very first thing that you started with in your talk tonight. So thank you.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, there's a place for, the Neil deGrasse Tysons and whatnot, but you talk to people too all the time, Go
Absolutely.
to Thanksgiving and stick your neck out and try and talk about what it is that you do with your family.
And before anything, I would like to apologize if I'm boring you with all my questions. So I was once in a coffee shop and started chatting with this engineer, and I told him I study astrobiology. And his first reply was, but that doesn't exist. There's no life out there. God made it. And it caught me off guard because he was an engineer. So do you have suggestions for dealing with people who might come in with preconceived notions? Like, how would you want to convince them?
Sure. Well, I think that what's difficult is that it's not a matter of convincing. I think the best dialogues happen when it's just two people talking from where they're at. And so it becomes difficult if they are trying to convince you of something, right? That's just as awkward, and you're like, ugh, as I'm sure they feel if you do the same, right? If you're like evangelizing for science. And so it's just like a clumsy thing. We have this in our museum, not all the time, but there's plenty of times when creationist groups come in and it kind of boggles my mind. I'm like, if you wanted to argue with my tour guide, like, it would have been nice to have a fair warning, but there are other groups that come, and it's just like it can be a dialogue. It doesn't have to be something that turns into a combative situation. And if you try and go from that place of just curiosity and asking them questions, having them ask you questions without that, motive behind it of like, I'm going to convert you. So I think that's the best. I mean, and you see this in our culture everywhere, right? Like Republicans and Democrats, they're just like, rah, rah, rah. And they just want to yell at each other. And, when really we need to open up spaces where people can talk. And so in that, I want to make I was going to make little handouts of like things for you to check out. One thing I would say that gets at that too is a radio program called On Being, which is about ethics, science, religion, and there are these long format interviews that the woman, Krista Tippett, she's a totally talented interviewer, but she has people, tons of scientists, she has poets, she has artists, all these people, and she has these long conversations with them. And so that the way that she talks to people is a really organic thing, and I feel like I'm learning more from listening to those podcasts.
Over here. So one of the things that I think you sort of have to deal with as a scientist is people hear, oh, you're a scientist, and then you're an expert on all things science. And even within astrobiology, I feel like we hedge a lot, and we're like, well, I don't know anything about this thing that's only very slightly removed from what I actually do. And so, I think on some level, maybe we have to be more comfortable talking about things that we're not actually experts in, because we probably know more about it than maybe the general public, but it's also really hard to say something when you're not up on whatever the research is or whatever. So I guess how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that's especially hard because your brain most of the time is very focused on the research, right? And so I think that it is a bit of permission to like switch your brain into I'm talking to the public or I'm talking to my family or whatever mode, where you don't have to be the expert. And I'm sure you do know a lot more about, likely you know a lot about whatever it is they're asking a question on. And so you can put some kind of like disclaimer in there about like, well, that's not really my area of study, but I'll tell you what I know about it. And I've found, I'm the queen of like spreading myself thin and not being a specialist. I have degrees in geology, but I've been an outreach specialist for 11 years now. And so I find that people are just hungry, and maybe you can even just give them references, not papers, but you might know of a really great website that they could go to, or, you might have those sorts of things that you can point people towards. But I would say, a lot of it is about being vulnerable and being okay with saying, I don't really know about that, which like, I know it's not cool to do that in your research group, right? To be like, well, I'm just going to throw my opinion out there on this thing that I'm not really a specialist in. But I think we need more of that.
Yeah, I'm actually going to respond to the last two points. So first, the one about astrobiology. Yeah, I've gotten that too. The problem was the first time I heard that, the guy was making a joke. So then the second time, I thought he was also making a joke. Did not turn out well. Unfortunately, sometimes when people start getting dogmatic, they've actually shown that certain parts of the brain are shutting down, and there isn't an easy way to have a rational discourse. I definitely think it's worth still trying, and I really like what you've said about being vulnerable and being willing to make it a conversation, like ask them questions about their concept and their understanding, if you feel comfortable sharing your own perception, if you have one, of God or a greater power, and how, if anything, that relates to your science. That's a tough one, and if it's going to be a hostile situation, just get out. Like, don't bother trying to, defend science when someone's just going to try and attack you. Becky, in relation to your question, what I've really discovered, and this definitely works with kids especially, is saying and being honest and saying, you know what? I don't know. Let's figure that out together. And doing whatever you can to help figure it out together. So you can start from basic principles. Like if it's something in a field you're not familiar with, start with whatever basic principles you remember from even high school. If it's really far removed from like the science you do now, and even going on to like Wikipedia, figuring out if there's anyone you know who, especially in an astrobiology community like this, you meet people, who you can say, you know what, I don't know, but I think if you talk to my friend Jenica, she might know the answer to that, and just kind of starting that is a really good place just to encourage that curiosity and recognize and like admit that, like we're not experts on all things science. Yeah, and I just want to especially comment on how I really appreciated kind of your thing about conversation. I've discovered that what really works with kids and adults is even starting presentations, not as like presentations so much as by asking questions and getting them to share their ideas or concepts about a certain thing. And that way you get them involved in the entire talk and thinking about things in a new way, almost as a scientist would.
Yeah.
So.
No, I think that's really true. I've worked with second and third graders in like an after-school club, and I went in, gung-ho to teach about rovers and landers on Mars, and I was a few weeks in, and I felt like we still weren't like quite there. Like they just weren't. I didn't know what was going on, but it didn't seem like they really understood what was going on. And then one of them, out of the blue, was like, "Oh, it's like WALL-E," which that's what we're gonna watch tonight. And suddenly they all understood what was going on. Like that was their connection point, was like WALL-E. That, and it's not, I think this is another thing that you have to kind of like step into a vulnerable place, because like the ways you talk to children especially, and oftentimes to adults too, you're gonna be making analogies that are not quite right. And you have to be okay with that. Like it's not like WALL-E is not like Curiosity really, but it's, it's in the right direction. And so then you can start heading down. And after that, like we were on a roll and we could really learn about Curiosity. But before that, I could tell there was something off. And so it can be, you just have to be humble and ask questions until you figure out what that thing is.
I've got a quick question. What's the job market like for outreach specialists, and what skills do people look for in outreach specialists?
Yeah. I really lucked out to be in my job. I don't have a great sense because I didn't have to search much. I went to graduate school here. I had been a tour guide in the department, and then decided to stay in Madison. Lots of people decide to stay here because it's awesome. And went to the then director and said, "Do you know about any jobs around in Madison?" Not expecting to get one at that museum, and it worked out. I would say that likely the avenue in for a lot of places is affiliation with a grant. So you'd be on soft money for a while, and then like you really kind of like make yourself indispensable, and then somebody's position opens up and you get that position. But I think for a lot of people it's kind of a little touch and go for a while because of soft money. But the great thing about that is that NASA especially and the NSF take broader impacts pretty seriously. I would say NASA very much, though it seems like every year there's a different budget crisis that happens with them. And so it's heartening to know that even if you decide to, if you don't go into outreach specifically, as a scientist, there's lots of different ways that you get to do this. Whether it's collaborating with somebody like me or doing it on your own, and there's lots of opportunities there. But yeah, I don't have a great sense for the job market.
That's it for the communication session today. So if we can give a round of applause again for Brooke.